You're listening to There Ought to Be a Law, the Center for Auto Safety podcast with Executive Director Michael Brooks, Chief Engineer Fred Perkins, and hosted by me, Anthony Cimino. For over 50 years, the Center for Auto Safety has worked to make cars safer. Hey everybody, welcome to the only podcast that will tell you, yes, you can lick a badger twice. What?
Whoa.
Yeah, I know. You think it's weird.
I think we need a little background on that.
Yeah, I know you guys are familiar with this. So this is it's vaguely
Are you sure
related
it's not a toad?
No.
No.
So apparently Google's AI, and AI runs everything now, it's hallucinating answers to made up things. So you can put in some made up idiom. Why can't you can never lick a badger twice, and it will explain what all of that means. And this is the technology that's driving our cars in the future.
You know, badgers are pretty feisty. I don't think I'd want to lick one once.
Well, you can't drive in my self-driving vehicle.
I don't think there's any evidence of cars licking badgers in the first place. So that may be beyond the scope of this discussion, but I'm willing to dive in.
Look, I tried something. I jumped out there. It got listeners' attention. I might have caused a car crash if somebody's listening to this driving down the road. What? But let's go right into NHTSA, okay? I want to start a little light before we go into the world of NHTSA. The Mr. Sean Duffy, he's released a new framework, and quoting from their press release, I guess, the new framework will unleash American ingenuity because it's been bound in a cage, maintains key safety standards, and prevent a harmful patchwork of state laws and regulations. So that's as far as I got before my head had cognitive dissonance issues, and I realized this is just nonsense. So that's where I turned to Michael Brooks. Michael Brooks, so NHTSA's changing their standing general order, saying that, hey, AVs got to report accidents unless you're Tesla?
They're modifying the standing general order, which, I think a lot of us are glad to see that they're only modifying it and not totally eliminating the standing general order, because they're going, level 2 technology is, just reaching a lot of America's cars, and it's kind of in its infancy. So having good crash reporting on incidents related to level 2 problems is really important. So that NHTSA can continue to do enforcement and recall operations to make sure that bad technology doesn't stay on the road. Although, it could be argued that the way they've approached Tesla doesn't suggest that they could do any of that. What they did essentially, a quick look at what they did with the standing general order is they basically reduced the circumstances under which crashes have to be reported. The new version is still going to capture fatality incidents, injury incidents where an airbags were deployed. But it looks like it's going to exclude a lot of incidents where there was no fatality or injury, where they're essentially fender bender type incidents or low speed incidents that don't result in injury or significant property damage, which ultimately is going to look. Most manufacturers are reporting very few of these incidents. A handful for most manufacturers, maybe a dozen. I think Honda it reported 100 and some odd incidents. So they're leading everyone except Tesla, which has reported over 2,000 incidents, and many of which are fatal crashes. I think there are 40 or so fatalities that have been reported by Tesla under standing general order. And what the agency is going to continue to receive reports from the most significant or most damaging crashes, but they're going to lose the opportunity to look at, all of those other incidents that didn't rise to the level of a crash, but could have helped them in their investigations or in their research into the problems. Because, not every time an ADAS fails is it going to lead to a crash. It's one of the reasons why, states like California are following, not just when they're looking at autonomous vehicle safety, they're not just looking at the fatal crashes. They're looking at things like disengagements, basically how many times are these things screwing up, which we talked about in the past, I believe on the podcast with Missy Cummings a few months back. So, you know, it's a good news, bad news situation for the standing general order. You know, the standing general order remains. That's good news. Bad news is it's not going to be capturing all the information that it did before. There's probably some other smaller issues in the new standing general order that won't interest our listeners too much, so we won't bother with those. But in addition to the standing general order modification, NHTSA also issued a letter basically saying, they're claiming this is going to unleash American productivity and autonomous vehicles and all that. But essentially, what they're doing is for the last 4 years or so, I think, well, maybe since 2016, the last 8 to 9 years, they've allowed foreign manufacturers to petition the agency for exemptions under an exemption provision, an exemption regulation that allows foreign manufacturers to say, hey, we want to bring this automated driving system into the United States and use it and test it on public roads. Can we have your permission? They've done this hundreds of times. I think it's 340 different ADS equipped vehicles that they've done that way. And the problem they're suggesting there is that that's allowing foreign manufacturers to exempt their automated vehicles or automated vehicle systems through that program, but domestic manufacturers don't have access to that provision. And so, we've seen General Motors and also Google Waymo apply for exemptions through the typical NHTSA process. And seems to be a process that requires a lot more submissions, which are important to ensure safety, require a lot more work by the agency. And for whatever reason, they take a long time. NHTSA can't seem to exempt these companies in time for them to get their operations going. And so there aren't many petitions filed by the domestic ADS manufacturers. Waymo is operating using vehicles that already meet federal motor vehicle safety standards rather than building a purpose-built autonomous vehicle because they can't, because the exemption process is hard for them to get through because NHTSA is basically standing in the way. That's kind of the red tape that's the only federal red tape that exists to stand in the way of testing autonomous vehicles. So basically, they're turning to another provision, which is a statute 49 USC 3114A, which basically says
close.
The secretary can say, if for research purposes, for demonstrations, for like race cars, there's a provision that allows the secretary to exempt certain vehicles, and they're going to start. They haven't issued the framework yet. They're going to announce the notice soon, and we'll get a little more insight into what this looks like. But they're going to start accepting applications under that provision from the domestic autonomous vehicle manufacturers and processing them accordingly to basically level the playing field. And I'll probably talk more about this a little later in the podcast. Yeah, but it's problematic for a number of reasons. The current NHTSA exemptions from federal motor vehicle safety standards require a showing that the vehicle is as safe or safer than the vehicles that meet the federal motor vehicle safety standards. The provision they're relying on here has no such requirement. In fact, it has very few requirements at all. It's basically like you apply to the secretary and the secretary makes the determination. And there's not really any standards there to ensure that safety is going to be considered. So that's a concern of ours. We're interested to see how that plays out. When NHTSA announces this, are they going to announce, that manufacturers do need to make certain safety showings? What's going to happen there? Stay tuned and we'll let you know as soon as we do.
Michael, for the hundreds or perhaps thousands, according to Anthony, of new listeners we get each week, who is NHTSA and why should we care?
NHTSA is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. They were established in the late 60s. I think they had a different name back there, something like the National Safety Bureau, something like that. But they became NHTSA, I believe, right in the early 70s. So they are in charge of really 2 to 3 major things. First, and it would be creating the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards that essentially create a minimum floor for safety, around things like your brakes, your tires, basically any part of your car that could impact safety, almost any. There's a standard that exists that tells manufacturers what they need to do. And then when a manufacturer goes to sell a car, they have to basically say, hey, we met all of these standards. If they didn't, they can get in trouble. That doesn't happen a whole lot, but NHTSA stays on top of that process and does the research and the rulemaking required to keep federal motor vehicle safety standards updated and in place. Also, importantly, NHTSA is in charge of doing safety investigations and recalls in their enforcement division, which we talk about ad nauseum on the podcast. You'll hear the recall roundup at the end. And essentially, beyond that, they also provide a lot of funding to state programs to ensure that states have the ability, whether it's through law enforcement or infrastructure, many other ways to make their streets and their highways safer. So NHTSA has a long history of essentially, I mean, you can look at some of the stuff they've released in January regarding the impact of federal motor vehicle safety standards and just how many lives have been saved since the agency came into existence. And they're the agency that essentially is behind getting seatbelts into your cars, and even beyond that, in giving money to states to promote seatbelt use. And also getting airbags into your car, along with a lot of other things that make you safer in your vehicle, like electronic stability control. And now they're going to, and analog braking. Also, now they're going to be heavily involved in automatic emergency braking standards, and how impactful those are remains to be seen. And other things as we move forward into this era of autonomy. NHTSA is going to be the cop on the beat when automated vehicles go bad. So they're incredibly important.
Well, that's great. So just again, for my reference, how many motor vehicle standards do they have in place now that relate to the unique hazards associated with self-driving vehicles?
None.
That's good for us, Fred. Because Fred and our AV company, we don't want standards.
Well, yeah, who needs it? I mean, we're really smart.
Yeah. So, Michael, related to this, because you said in this changes to the standing general order that now you just get the secretary to give you an exemption, and you don't need to. There's no talk of safety. So for Fred and mine, our self-driving robo-taxi company, so we're not using steering wheels. We don't have any pedals and whatnot because expense. We don't even want to put in a big red button to stop the car in an emergency for people because, again, that's an expense. Since there's no mention of safety in this standard, what do we do? Do we put a fruit basket to the secretary? Like, what's the process for getting approved?
I mean, it is that's what we're waiting to see. We're waiting to see, exactly what the process involves. I mean, you have to think that there's going to be some required safety showing. I mean, there are people at NHTSA who will be evaluating this beyond. It's not just going to be, a totally political decision made by the Secretary of Transportation. There's going to be things exchanged. I'm sure a lot of paper exchange between manufacturers and NHTSA and the DOT to make sure that these vehicles are safe. I can't imagine that you're going to be able to get away with putting a fruit basket in the vehicle instead of a red button, right? But we just
put in
don't know.
macadamia nuts.
At this point, we just don't know. This standard has never been used in this way. This regulates a statute, actually. It's never been used in this way, so we're not exactly sure what it entails or what the process is going to be.
No, but California is putting some standards in place for licensing that seem, at least on the surface, to be very reasonable. What is the history of regulations flowing from California to Washington versus from Washington to California?
There's a big history of California kind of being out front. In fact, if you look at the way that emissions and fuel economy are regulated, California law comes up a lot because California does some things in those areas that the federal government doesn't. And there's a conflict in the law sometimes between federal and state law around that. But when it comes to things like licensing, that's an area where the states have traditionally exercised total authority over. You get your driver's license from your state, not from the federal government. And so that's an area that has a lot of it really becomes complex when you're talking about automated vehicles because in an autonomous vehicle, NHTSA has traditionally regulated, things like the design of vehicles are and the construction of vehicles, how the vehicles perform are kind of the domain of NHTSA regulation. They don't get into, whether a driver is good enough to drive the vehicle, but in an autonomous vehicle, you've got that. You've got that driver inside of the vehicle as part of that design, construction, and performance. So, a lot of the red tape that the government talks that manufacturers talk about, we hear all the time this phrase, there's a patchwork of state regulations that are preventing auto manufacturers from being able to deploy autonomy into states. Well, I mean, that's true. There's a patchwork of state regulations because states create very different laws depending on how each state wants to manage its own roads and highways. And some states really want autonomous vehicle companies to come into their state because they see it as a source of economic prosperity. Others, that have experienced things like they experienced in San Francisco a couple of years back and continuing through today, even we continue to see problems coming out. Uh, they have a kind of a different view and they want to maintain some power in the equation to say, hey, your car is not doing well on our streets. You're blocking ambulances and fire trucks. You're almost hitting pedestrians. We don't want you here. The industry doesn't want states to have that authority. They want the federal government to come out and issue autonomous vehicle regulations and preempt states from having really any say in how their operations are run. So when you hear patchwork of federal regulations, what you should be thinking is not that there's somehow all these competing state laws that are hurting the ADAS industry and that they need to be freed from that. You should be thinking about, don't states have a right to determine which drivers are on their roads? Yes, they do, and they have for many, many years. And that's one of the inherent complications here is that manufacturers of autonomy really want to preempt state law with federal regulation so that they can deploy these vehicles at will and not have to deal with states.
Okay, well, I think Fred,
Thanks.
I think since we're not going to have any pedals and whatnot, I don't even have windows in our car because we don't need them, and that's just glass, costs money. I think we go for the fruit basket that contains macadamia nuts. I mean, I think we can afford it now, and we do that.
I like kiwis.
You
You're
do
not the
like kiwis.
audience. You're not the look. You're not the regular. We've been through this. This is why we're never going to get off the ground. Okay.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'm not investing in your company.
no,
Oh,
please,
come on.
please. I mean, your T-shirt. Come on, look. Anyway, speaking of another nut, Jeff Bezos.
Yep.
So Jeff Bezos, he's one of these billionaire guys. Is like, hey, I've got all this money. I don't have any friends. Let's try human growth hormone. Nope, that didn't work. I got a phallic rocket. Maybe people will like me then. I don't know. So now he's going a different route, and he's rumor has it. I don't know if it's confirmed, but this little AV electric, no, it's not an AV, an electric truck for around 20 grand called Slate Auto. And it's kind of a neat idea where I have a bunch of questions around safety, but
Yeah.
it's a pickup truck that is just in one configuration, but you as a consumer say, hey, it's a flat pickup truck, but I'll add on a module that now makes it an SUV or now makes it, I don't know, a rocket ship, or I can put my gym
Yeah.
weights in there, bro. Um, so we have a link to the article in Ars Technica. They go through it. But so Michael, on this thing, it's if it actually sells for less than 30K, because I don't know if you noticed, billionaires, they talk about their electric trucks and their pricing is wildly, wildly inaccurate.
Yeah.
Um, can you so this thing will be crash tested in its default configuration, but then apparently I can buy an add-on that now changes the flatbed to SUV seating. Like, how does how did
That's
who
nothing new, right? I mean, Toyota 4Runners have been doing that forever. In fact, I spent most of high school riding around the back seat of one of those. But
wait.
this is a cool idea. I mean, look, they're saying they're including the cost of the EV credit in
Right.
that price, right? They think it's going to be, mid 20,000s, high 20,000s. I don't know if they're going to be able to make that or not, but they're saying that they're going to try to get the starting price under $20,000 with your federal clean vehicle tax credit. It's a really basic vehicle. Like, I kind of like this idea because you hear me all the time bitching about a number of things. One of them is really heavy EV pickup trucks,
Right.
and one of them is this is an EV that serves utility purposes. I can throw 30 bags of mulch in the back of it. I can turn it into a 5-seat SUV if I want to take my family somewhere. I can drive it into work everywhere, and it's small enough and light enough to where it's actually, producing some good benefits for the climate, you know, and it has windows that roll up using the crank, right?
I know manually controlled
And
windows.
it
Mind blowing.
doesn't have a lot of the electric mess and junk. It doesn't have screens. It doesn't have, a lot of the things that, screens cause distraction and some other problems. And we've seen Lord knows how many recalls related to screens. I mean, obviously, I think it's going to have a screen to meet the FMVSS 111, the rear view camera thing, right? You have to have a screen to display that image on. So it's going to have a screen, but I don't know. I like this idea. If I don't know that you're going to have, all the guys driving 7,000-pound pickups right now are not going to go out and buy this. I think this is more geared towards the Honda Ridgeline type
Right.
market, kind of the suburban dad who doesn't want to drive a massive pickup market, instead of the macho guy who needs a giant truck to look big. But it's interesting. This is the kind of pickup truck we need to take over the pickup truck market. Whether that will happen or not is highly in question.
So do we know if this is a real thing or not?
It has been it has been put on a stage and introduced as Slate Auto, and
Okay.
they've unveiled their first EV. It's called the Slate Truck.
Okay. And so
Um,
I got to go back to my original question around. So you buy this truck and you can convert it to an SUV, and you're saying Toyota 4Runner does that? Like, I
yeah,
understand
I mean, there
you
used to
can do that.
be Toyota 4Runners back in the day. You could pull out the back seat, take off the top, and you had functionally a pickup, right?
Oh, but this is
Um,
different though, because this is a flatbed that you're then converting. Like it's adding stuff to it. That's what I'm wondering from a safety perspective.
yeah.
Because if Joe Blow's doing that, that just seems
Look, I mean,
dangerous. I don't know.
it's look, cars have been made with removable seats for quite some time now. Lots of
Okay.
minivans, other things. I had a
Jeeps.
Honda Odyssey years ago. You have to make sure that when you're putting the seats back in, that you're getting them secured properly. That's really important, because if your seat's not attached to the car, then you're in a whole world of trouble in a crash. So I would recommend that people, you get someone who's knowledgeable and who knows what they're doing to do that. But it's something that's been around for quite some time, and it can certainly be executed safely. So I don't really see that as a problem here. Really, I mean, I think the biggest problem here is building this vehicle at that price seems incredibly difficult. But if we had $20,000 electric pickups like this available, I think that's great in this current market. There's nothing like it.
I
Okay.
think of it as the Model T meets the Jetsons. You've got all of the technology that's available, but what the joke was about Model T was you can get it in any color you want as long as it's black. So,
Yeah.
you've got a basic frame, and it probably will be listed on Amazon with a list of options, including hats and sweaters that are, have appropriate logos on them. So we don't know exactly what's going to be in it, but it is a really interesting technical and marketing idea.
All right. Well, the I think an also interesting technical and marketing idea is to go to autosafety.org and click on donate. That.
I can't wait to see these slates in the Piggly Wiggly parking lot. That's going to be a lot
Oh,
of fun.
so we were talking this car that doesn't have power windows, which I think the last time I was in a car that had a crank was maybe the early 90s. I don't know.
I don't know.
And
We just saw a pickup truck with a crank in it in the White House lawn.
wow, well played,
Oh, thank
Mr.
you.
Perkins. 2 points to you. Checking the scoreboard. It's just Fred. Uh no, let's be serious now. So thestar.com, this is a Toronto newspaper, talking about the dangers of everything being electrified inside your car. And we've talked about this with the problems with what's that guy? Tesla. Where their door handles and everything are all electric. And so when you're in a crash and you don't have any power, your door handles don't work. But you, as a savvy Tesla shopper, clearly read the manual and know that, oh, you have to bend down, remove a speaker grill, reach in there, pull an orange cord, and hope that disengages the electronic systems and opens the door. So I'm going to quote from this article here. Vehicles with these systems do have redundant emergency mechanical interior releases, but as they are not always obvious, Tesla, and they're not used in normal circumstances, occupants may not be aware of them. That can be fatal. And we've talked about this 100 times. I think we came up with the solution for these systems. Pull twice, and engage in
Yeah.
mechanical release.
Yeah, that's kind of it. I mean, this article goes into a number of different situations where the introduction of either electrical or computer systems into vehicles has created a safety issue versus making things safer. I mean, I think a simple way to look at this is the introduction of power windows. You know, when we had the crank to crank windows up, we didn't see people getting caught in windows. We didn't see children being strangled by power windows rolling up on their necks. We didn't see pets getting killed in the same way. As soon as power windows came out, we started seeing a few of these incidents every year where children were killed or injured when windows were rolled up, and kids could stand on a armrest, for instance, or put their knee on an armrest with their head out the window, and the window rolls up onto their necks. We would see that frequently, and it was a terrible thing. And we petitioned on a number of occasions before finally some provisions were included in federal standards to prevent the type of rocker switches that you might remember power windows having, where the switch was just kind of it's hard to describe, like kind of a flattened light switch, but it allowed now we have these power window switches that you have to pull up on to make the windows go up, so that someone standing, a child standing, or a child messing around with it wouldn't necessarily allow them to become trapped inadvertently in the window. So, when you introduce new features to vehicles, there are safety concerns that can arise depending on how well those features were designed and how much consideration the designers put into all the potential things that can happen in a vehicle with humans. And so this article is pointing that out in reference to the electrical retracting door handles, which we've talked about a lot. How hard it is to escape Tesla when you're not totally familiar with the owner's manual. But there are a lot of examples of this, and I think another good example is the unintended safety problems that occur when you introduce technology. We've seen phantom braking occur because of automatic emergency braking. If that's not reined in, it could really prevent automatic emergency braking from becoming the success that it should be. So there are a lot of. I think that the overarching thrust of this article is we need to be careful when we're introducing features into vehicles that we don't have a lot of experience with.
So with power windows, when that came out, now there's systems in place. If it feels pressure, it backs off. How long before power windows, when they're released, and then they realized, oh, I don't want to kill my kids, let's put in this little safety thing?
It was forever. I mean, it was, I want to
Really?
say they were probably introduced in the 50s or 60s. We petitioned NHTSA to put a standard in that required, first of all, the rocker, the type of switch used was important, because kids standing or playing around the armrest, you had kids rolling windows up on the neck of their, brother, a sibling,
Right.
someone else in the car with them, themselves. And the rocker switch was just bad, really bad about that happening. These weren't, this wasn't an epidemic across America. There were, a few incidents, maybe in the teens every year in a really bad year. But it's something that was such an easy fix that finally, I think it was in the 2000s after this happening for 40 years or so, and I think on our third petition to NHTSA to try to fix the problem where they did that. And I think that they did not do everything we wanted there. We wanted all vehicles to have the auto reverse. I had a 2000 and I think 2003 Volkswagen Jetta at the time, and it had auto reverse on it, but it was made in Europe, right? So none of the American cars were required to have that, and so that they ended up not mandating the auto reverse part, but they did say, if you if you had auto reverse, you get credited for it somehow in the regulation. So it is taken into account, but not as forcefully as we would have liked to have seen. But that's a problem that since that rocker switch and the new standard came into place that we haven't heard a lot about. Hopefully that's because these instances have stopped happening in the newer model vehicles.
Oh my word! I didn't realize it was that long. I figured it was like,
Yeah, well, I mean,
a
it
couple
takes
years.
when there's a problem that occurs somewhat infrequently, even if it's killing children as it was in this case. When you to get a federal rule passed around it, you still have to show show you have to make the government does a cost benefit analysis essentially and looks at the cost of making this change and putting the regulation into place and weigh that against all the incidents and the deaths and injuries that happened. We also see this problem in the area of seatbelts on school buses. We have
Right.
so few incidents of children dying on school buses each year because the school buses are very large and fairly protective of their occupants. And we I might have discussed this a couple of weeks ago. We talked about transit system safety and the buses and how safe they are. But when you do the cost benefit analysis, there are so few crash deaths and injuries involved that the cost to put in seatbelts on every school bus in America outweighs that. And you get you even, I mean, it's crazy. That's a crazy one because you get school districts coming to NHTSA and saying we can't afford to put seatbelts on school buses to protect the kids we're supposed to be protecting. So it's a very odd situation, but it kind of shows you you have to have you have to be able to show a fairly substantial amount of harm ongoing in order to essentially allow a federal regulation to make it through the cost benefit analysis and become a rule.
Well, thank God Doge will fix all of that for us.
Oh,
Speaking of gaslights, let's do that. I'm gonna kick off with ARC. That's right. Kathy Wood
all
at
right.
ARC. I get their newsletter. It makes me weep for humanity.
They
And
still want
they're
us to buy Tesla?
oh yeah, the headline is Tesla is on track for its robotaxi launch in June. And their quoting is basically they just cut and paste a Tesla press release with no understanding of history and all the other lies coming out of Tesla. What's the saying? For those who don't know history, Kathy Wood's an idiot. I think that's how the phrase goes. I think
Yeah,
could
I
have
don't
it wrong.
understand I don't understand why anyone listens to these people.
I don't understand either, but yep, I'm sticking with my classics. This week it was Arc Automotive for me, or not Arc Auto, Arc Investment, whatever it is, whatever nonsense pump and dump scheme it is. This is my personal opinion, not the opinion of the Center for Auto Safety. Look at that little
Um,
disclaimer. Michael, what do you got?
Mine, I'm going back to something we just talked about that I said I'd probably talk about later because I knew it was coming in the gaslight. It is part of NHTSA's relying on this new, it's not a new statute, it's the secretary's ability to exempt a vehicle. If you look at that statute, there's a problem. And this, I'm going to use this as my gaslight of the week. The statute that they're using for exemption purposes only contemplates the exemption of a single vehicle or piece of equipment. And I'm going to test you to see if y'all agree with this. So here's how it reads. It says the Secretary of Transportation may exempt a motor vehicle or item of motor vehicle equipment from section 3112A of this title. That's the section that requires you to meet motor vehicle safety standards. On terms the secretary decides are necessary for research, investigation, demonstrations, training, competitive racing events, show, or display. When do you think that could be used to exempt an entire fleet of autonomous vehicles when it says, a motor vehicle or item of motor vehicle equipment? I legally, the plain reading of the statute suggests to me that they can't use that. And yet they're apparently basing their entire new framework to release automated vehicles onto the roads around this statute, which for whatever reason, I can't wrap my head around how they think this statute allows them to do what they're going to do with it.
I've got it,
Well,
but Fred, what do you think?
I think regarding that, we have a Supreme Court that allows interpretation of only one of the clauses in the Second Amendment as the law of the land. So apparently, full sentences no longer have to be read as, a coherent thought in order to determine what people do. So I don't know. There's a precedent for stupidity and ignorance as
That's
part of the federal law. So
that's pretty
there's
good.
that.
My take on it is you said a part of a vehicle, right? And
Yeah,
so
or
this
item. Yeah,
the item
yeah.
in this case would be the computer brain.
Yeah, but is
I
it is
think
it is it one computer brain?
it's the
It's,
collective computer brain because they're all the same thing, man. We're all like connected in the universe. Like it's
the
a
neural network,
yeah,
man.
it's like you can't lick a badger twice. Everybody
Yeah.
knows this.
Can
'Cause-
zombies eat computer brains?
Whoa.
That's something we need to research. I don't
AZs.
have that. All right,
While
so
you're listening to this
I,
podcast,
I gotta
go to
run
Fred
this.
Perkins.
I gotta
Deep
run into my
questions.
gaslight here. So I've got a new contender this week. Our friends
Uh-oh.
at Volkswagen and Uber. So they've announced a long-term strategic relationship to deploy autonomous ID buzz vehicles on the Uber platform. And they go on to talk about how wonderful it's going to be. But the reason I think this is a great gaslight nominee is that they never talk about the legal consequences or liability consequences of this. Now, we know from court action in New Jersey that Uber will vigorously defend itself against any claims of damages associated with accidents or collisions with their cars by virtue of people's prior Uber Eats behavior. And right,
Yeah.
so what this announcement does not talk about is how its users can become liable for damages, or its users can be prosecuted for negligent operation or whatever those right words are, but it doesn't talk at all about the legal consequences that can have devastating effects on people who blithely turn over the credit card and go for a ride. This is a problem that is also being ignored by Waymo and the other people licensed to do operations, commercial operations in California. But I think that Volkswagen and Uber know about this, and the failure to warn people that they're going to be they're going to be hung by their French fries is something that really ought to be required in this. So there's my gaslight nomination this week.
That's a good one. I
Oh,
like that because Volkswagen and Ford had a AV company partnership that they shut down a couple years ago because they did the math and realized, oh, these taxi systems, it's not going to work. But now they're like, well, Uber's the newest sucker. They'll go for it. Yeah, it's fascinating. I thought Volkswagen had totally left this game because math.
So who wins, Anthony? You keep giving yourself the winning vote
Well,
for
no, you've won
gaslight, but I
sometimes.
think that's completely unfair and biased.
Well, this is the way the world works. It's
Well,
you
that's
win based
true.
off of reverse height order.
Yeah, Anthony's the
So
decider.
yeah, I am the decider exactly. I'm gonna give it to Michael this week. I'm sorry. I mean,
Ah, damn it.
Fred, you're close, but you did step out. You brought somebody new into it, which is good. It was bold. I appreciate that, but yeah, Michael's gonna win because he got very specific with 30, 11, 12, or something.
Life can be so unfair.
It can be indeed, but you know what? I like the sound of your voice, Mr. Perkins. So let's talk about redundancy. Wait, didn't we
Whoa.
already talk about redundancy? Let's
Didn't we
talk about
talk about that
redundancy
last week?
again.
Yeah.
Again.
You've
Yes,
now entered
yes.
the Tao
Yeah.
of Fred.
So, thoughtful listener commented that use of different sensors on a vehicle does not constitute redundancy. And
No.
people who are promoting AVs have been kind of fast and loose about talking about redundancy as a way of guaranteeing AV safety. So I thought I'd dig into that just a little bit and talk about the difference between redundancy and complementarity. So think of two radars that a car might have, both of which are attached to the front bumper, right? And either one of which, if it's working, will provide inputs to the car's control system that can be perceived as objects and all that sort of stuff, right? So is that redundant or not?
Uh, is it? Are they set up in a failover situation? So if radar A fails, we'll try radar B.
Let's assume for the moment that it is.
I'm gonna say redundant.
Michael?
Redundancy requires doesn't it require the essentially the exact same system, just a number two?
Oh, Michael. You're actually smart. So I mean, Anthony, you may be smart too, but let's just roll past that.
Oh, it sounds like
So,
my guidance counselor in high school.
so no two physical devices are ever identical. So there's that, right? You got manufacturing differences between them, and that's inevitable. Even if you had two radars attached to the same bumper, they can be redundant with regard to distant objects because the
Yeah,
angle of the object may be unimportant for what they're trying to do. So if you're talking about objects very close to the car, then they're not, because the fields of view and the fields of regard have areas that do not overlap. So when you talk about redundancy, you've always got to talk about redundancy for what purpose and what are you trying to do. So if you're comparing, for example, a LiDAR to a radar, are they redundant?
No.
Well, Michael?
I don't think that's redundant. If you had two lidars who were checking each other, that would be redundancy. But a lidar and a radar can't be redundant, right?
Well,
Well, I mean,
it depends on what they're being used for, right? If you're using both devices to look for, we'll say, the tail end of a car ahead of you, that's 100 feet ahead of you, then you could say the processed information provides redundancy on a system level because what you're looking for is the back of the car. You can also say, well, they're
right.
complementary because they're providing different kinds of data. So they may detect different aspects of that car in front of them. So you got to be careful about what your end purpose for those sensors is going to be. If you're talking about data fusion of different
Yeah.
sensors and putting all that information together, come up with a consolidated result, right? So it's not just the tail end of a car, it's the tail end of a car of, we'll say, an Opel Kadett, right? Because my LiDAR is now looking at it and it's really getting in close and getting all that information. So if your objective is just to see the tail end of a car, then yeah, you got some redundancy there. If your objective is to get information that's only available from one of those sensors versus the other, then there's no redundancy. So I think that was the point that the attentive listener was trying to bring out, that there's a difference between complementarity and redundancy. But now, if you think of it in other levels, when people talk about redundancy, they typically say, well, we have coverage, 360-degree coverage of the car, right? So it's really good, it's smart, they can see everything going on around it. Well, again, you've got a problem because the different sensors cover different areas of the car. So there are overlapping portions of the fields of view or fields of regard. And the difference between those two is a little bit subtle, but field of review is if it field of view is if it's stationary relative to the car and it's just looking forward and it's the angle that it can see. But if it can move the sensor relative to the car right and left, then you get a larger area, which is called the field of regard. Anyway, that's an aside. But the point is that we live in a 3D world. So if your assertion is that you have 360 degrees of coverage, you've also got to say how far up and down it looks, right? So in order for a AV to discriminate between, we'll say, a bridge and a tractor trailer that's crossing a road, it's got to be able to determine the vertical angle as well as the distance to say, well, this clearly is a trailer because it's only 100 feet ahead of me and it's only 3 feet off the ground versus a bridge, which you would say, well, it's a quarter mile ahead. And by the angle that I've got here, it's clearly 16 feet above the ground. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to use that. So even the claims that companies say about 360-degree coverage have got to be tempered by your understanding of the angle of elevation that it's providing data from, which the combination of the two angles necessary to resolve a point in space are called the Euler angles, because Professor Euler a long time ago determined that those are what's required. And if you talk about angle and elevation, those Euler angles need to be associated with the data that you're looking at in order to make a factual and supportable claim of 360-degree coverage. Similarly, if there's a child close to the front of the vehicle, you've got to be able to look down towards the child's feet in order to determine that there is something in front of your car really close in that you would be able to detect maybe with one sensor, but maybe not with another. So again, redundancy versus complementarity affects the safety of the vehicle when it's trying to, for example, avoid children or navigate through a parking lot versus being out on the open highway and trying to determine that there's a truck a quarter mile ahead of you. It's complex. People need to be skeptical, and there's no company that I've seen so far that is reporting the full scope of their coverage of sensors with regard to both angle of elevation and angle of direction from the front of the car, right? Both azimuth and elevation. So that's more discussion. You have any questions about that? It's kind of complex, but the bottom line is that the information we're receiving from the AV companies about the safety associated with their sensor coverage is very spotty and inadequate. And it's impossible to tell whether or not they're sufficiently safe based upon the information that any of these companies has provided to the public.
Hmm. So don't trust anybody over the age of 30. That's what
Or
I'm
don't
getting.
trust anybody over the angle of 30, maybe.
uh, yeah, you'd think maybe they'd put this in some sort of federal regulation to say, hey, this is what your coverage needs to be. Is that
Well,
wishful thinking?
there needs to be something because we know that Teslas have beheaded at least two unfortunate owners as they
Under
passed
a trailer,
underneath
yeah.
tractor trailers or tried to pass underneath tractor trailers that were crossing the highway. In response to that, I don't think there's been any federal regulation. There's been a couple of NTSB reports. We have no knowledge that Tesla has modified their control system in any way to avoid that in the future. And as they move ahead with their apparently self-driving vehicle for autonomous operations, you said it was going to be in June, Anthony.
Well,
We
that's what
should,
my friend Kathy said.
I think the public should really know a lot more about how they're going to be controlled and where the dead spots are in their sensor
Oh,
coverage.
you had to use the phrase dead spots. Oh,
Unfortunate choice of words, or maybe a
yeah.
fortunate choice of
Yeah.
words, but that's
Well, I mean, I think their dead spot is at the CEO level.
well, I don't know. He
Man.
was one of the cranks that were available in the vehicle on the White House lawn.
The man with the unfortunate gesture. Speaking of unfortunate gestures, let's do a little update on my home, New York. How I've got a couple ones here where Where did it go? Where the feds, they're like, hey, you can't have congestion pricing. Stop it. It's against something. I don't know what it's against. It doesn't really matter. As far as we can tell to date, congestion pricing has been incredibly effective in the borough of Manhattan. The traffic accidents are down. The city's more walkable. The local retailers and restaurants are happier. Everyone's good except for the Great Orange Man. And so it seems I'm gonna say that some lawyers in the Southern District of New York, they quote unquote accidentally released their opinions to the court system, which is public information, saying, "Hey, there's no way this lawsuit works. This is a dumb idea." And then they're like, "Oops, we didn't mean to do that," and they backed it out. Uh, and I guess maybe they're looking for a job now. I don't really know, but
They might be. I mean, this is, it's one of the things you really shouldn't do as a lawyer is post your confidential memos to the court docket, and when those memos explicitly talk about how poor your case is. And I think anyone that has looked into this situation kind of agrees. This is something that New York totally has the authority to do. And the federal government has very little authority to challenge it, but for whatever reason, and we're still trying to figure out why people hate congestion pricing so much when they don't even live in New York City and want to fight against it.
government.
Maybe New Jersey has some significant lobbying power that we're unaware of. That they've got the ear of Transportation Secretary Duffy and Trump, but it's an incredibly bad move by these lawyers at the DOJ, and a really bad mistake. I mean, it's almost hilarious if you read the document that they posted, because it is essentially, it sounds like us. It's talking about how the congestion pricing has been an incredible success. And also talks about all of the ways in which the Trump administration will lose a challenge if they try to file a lawsuit. But here we are, and the lawsuit still stands. They've removed that document from the docket, and we'll see how the lawsuit proceeds. Although, based on the opinions of the DOJ attorneys who were bringing the lawsuit, it doesn't seem like it's got a very good chance.
No, they're basically pointing out, hey, this has already gone under federal review for a number of years. It's already survived a number of challenges. This is a public thing that went on for 8 years, I think, something like that. So yeah, it's too late. The Tesla has left the barn. Wait, no. Is that how you say that phrase? I'll ask Google and find out. The next one is, speaking of Tesla, New York lawmakers are trying to shut down Tesla stores. This is an article in Electric where it's talking about how, I guess because of some old boy dealer network back in the day, that car
Yeah,
dealers couldn't compete against the manufacturers. So if I'm Bob's Ford Motor Company can't be like, I'm selling my own thing right here because it's unfair
right,
competition. Makes
right.
sense. Tesla's never had a dealer network, so they're like, we're just going to sell things direct to the consumer. Now, as a consumer, at times I'm like, hey, that sounds pretty good. But the lawmakers in the great state of New York think Elon Musk's a dick. So they're like, hey, let's stop this. We have a law in the book. Let's poke this guy in the eye. That's kind of my takeaway, and I will stand
Yeah, I
behind it.
mean, there's a lot of states where they basically say, look, we're going to protect our car dealers lobby. They get laws put on the books that say, General Motors can't come into my state and open its own dealership and compete with me. Um, and these laws were, on the books in many states for quite a long time. And so when a company like Tesla comes along that wants to sell their vehicles direct to consumers without opening up dealerships in those states, um, or even if they want to, they have to get a waiver of some sort. And so Tesla comes in and lobbies for either a waiver or for a change in the law to allow them to sell there. New York State, they gave Tesla a waiver to allow them to, I think they opened up a few dealerships in the state and are able to sell their vehicles directly to the public there. And now New York's saying, oh, wait, we can take this waiver away from you. And it looks like they're considering doing that. We don't have any information, I think, on whether this is passed yet or not. It looks like it's just a bill that's making its way through the New York legislature. But that's one way to poke the bear, I guess. If I don't know that this is going to stop the sale of Teslas in New York, I'm sure that people could still, order their Cybertruck and have it delivered to them, or cross the pay a toll and cross the bridge and go buy one in another state close by. But it's interesting nonetheless that Elon's mouth is getting him into trouble in even more ways.
Oh boy, what a misunderstood man. Now I think we understand him pretty clearly. Let's go to recall.
Strap in.
All
Time
right.
for the recall roundup.
First one up is from a company I've never heard of before in my life, Dorel Juvenile Group, which sounds like a law firm for juvenile delinquents. 1,790,
No,
100,000.
no,
This is,
yeah.
yeah, this is a big number. Almost 180,000 items. This is the Go Grow and Go Sprint, which is a car seat, which it seems the kids are eating the foam of the headrest. What? Why? Why?
Yeah.
Is it because
And this is something that you should be familiar with from your childhood. But these are basically they manufacture these car seats in such a way that young children are able to um, take the headrest apart and stick it in their mouth and eat it, and small pieces of foam could choke the child. And so there are a number. This is an investigation, I believe, that NHTSA has been conducting for I wonder, a little over a year. They've been looking into this with Durrell, and they kind of honed in on the headrests that are the problematic ones. And now Durrell's going to have to recall them. If you are an owner of one of these child seats, it's important, if you're not registered, that you reach out to Durrell, because they won't know where you are. Unlike vehicles, child seats aren't registered with your state, and manufacturers don't have access to a list of owners like they would if they search state registration records. So it's important for you to take some initiative as a parent and as the owner of one of these child seats, and reach out to the company. If you did register your car seat with the company, they should be reaching out to you sometime in the middle of June.
But I want to know, why are your kids managing to spin their head 180 degrees so they can chomp on the headrest? I mean, that's
Well,
I
what I
think
want to
that
know is
they're
how,
removing it. I think they're pulling it, kind of like pulling
behind.
it off. Yeah, yeah.
hasn't
Okay.
RFK Jr. recommended eating plastic foam to prevent measles?
He said we shouldn't do that, and that's how you get the parasite into
But I digress. Yes.
Yeah, that's pretty good,
Yeah.
Anthony.
That
And
was-
in your impersonation list, that one may be number one.
Oh, hey, all
You've
right,
done,
show's
you've done
over.
some,
No.
yeah. You've done some really bad Elons where he sounds just
Well,
like Trump, but that one
yeah.
that's a good RFK.
All right, well, that's good. When did car seats come about? Because they didn't exist when I was a child, or we
Are
were
you
just too poor and we were just eating headrests.
I,
Did you have a child
I,
car seat as a kid?
I think I remember my brother having one. I think
Oh,
the
I know.
first ones came
They
out
came
in the
about it
60s.
right around
60s.
1980, because my first daughter was born 1977. They didn't exist.
Right.
And my second daughter was born 1979, and they were expensively optional thing. You could get them, but they weren't very common. But it was the early 80s when people started to really think about them and talk about, making sure that kids were always in a car seat, and et cetera, et cetera. So
Yeah.
yeah, my first daughter had to bring home in a bathtub because that was all that there was.
Wow.
Or they call them bassinets, but still, it was basically just a little bathtub.
I see. I imagined a cast iron bathtub. Your daughter in the back of the pickup truck. You're just like, we splash a little water in there. She's good.
That's how we did things up in the hills here.
Next up, we have a little company called General Motors. 597,630 vehicles. The 2021 to 2024 Cadillac Escalade, the Cadillac Escalade ESV, the Chevy Silverado 1500, the Chevrolet Suburban, Tahoe, Sierra, Yukon, a whole bunch of them. Engine teardown analysis identified the engine will fail and lose propulsion. Oh, that's not good. It looks like the crankshaft will have a manufacturing defect. defect, which can damage the engine. Oh, your connecting rod or crankshaft falling apart.
Yeah,
That's
and this one,
that's not
this
good.
one's interesting for a number of reasons. I mean, it's a very large recall, and it's something that NHTSA has been looking into for some time regarding General Motors. These are the big trucks and SUVs, from 21 to 24. They if you look into if when we're normally looking at recalls here, there's a field says estimated percentage with defect, and invariably that number is going to be 1% or less or so.
Right.
Here it's 3%, and that's because this is happening to a ton of GM trucks. They had the investigation in GM identified 28,102 field complaints related to the engine failure.
Oh my God.
Um, and half of those 14,000 involved allegations of losing propulsion, which is where the safety issue comes in. And I think that 14,000 loss of propulsion, if you compare it to the 597,000 vehicles recalled, is where that 3% number came from. But that's an incredibly high rate of failure. Typically vehicle defects occur as a very small portion of the population of vehicles. It could be 1 in 1,000. Anything over 1 in 100 is a fairly high number. And here it's 3 in 100. So that suggests that these are very bad engines, maybe even as bad as some of the Hyundais and Kias that were keeping us busy a few years back.
Wow. Get that fixed, people. Next up, Honda, 152,800 vehicles, the 2014 to 2020 Acura MDX. Due to an uneven sealing surface, moisture can enter the tailgate lid light and cause the light to fail. So there's a wiring harness, short circuit, sealing thing. All right. It's
Yeah.
not the sexiest recall, but hey, it's important.
It looked like that it mostly affects your rear lights, the tail lights, but
And they're behind me. I
if
can't
the
see them.
short occurs, it can also screw up your whole lighting system, and I think not really migrate. I don't know what the word would be, but it's going to short circuit your lighting system, and so you may have no light. So it's a
Cascade.
pretty significant safety issue if this problem occurs in your vehicle, and it's a large recall. It looks like this one, 2% of these vehicles have this defect. So we've got some pretty interesting defects this week with high rates. Owners can expect to hear from Honda Acura at the end of next month, right around Memorial Day. And it looks like you're going to have to go in and get a number of things fixed to make sure that you don't have this problem again. So it might be a slightly longer repair. It's probably not just going to be a walk in and walk out of your dealership repair.
Mhm. Next up, Ford. Jim Farley, you always have an open invite to the show. 160,729 vehicles. The 2015 Ford F Super Duty F250, F350, F450. The 2015 Ford Expedition, the Lincoln Navigator, Lincoln MK6. Never heard of that one. But what's going to happen this one? Come on, Fred. What do you think this recall is? It's Ford. It's a recall. Come on. What's the winner?
I'm guessing rear camera.
Yes, rear view camera. That is right. Terminal header fretting corrosion results from a combination of they got solder issues, and the rear view camera will fail. All right, that's
Yeah.
all I'm gonna say. Yeah, that
Well,
sums that up.
well, I mean, this is one of two this week
Oh,
from
don't
Ford.
give it away. Why give it away?
I know you like your little Easter eggs, but that's not happening.
Oh,
Um, so they get I don't understand some of this stuff. Terminal header fretting corrosion. That's going to be some corrosion in the electrical system here, but it causes or it results from damaged solder reflow oven at the tier one camera supplier. Don't know what that means, but it looks like ultimately
Do you want to
it
know what? Do you
messes.
want to know what that means?
nah,
Yeah,
it's really
yeah.
late in the show.
All right.
Okay.
So when they make the electronic circuit boards, they basically uh, drop the circuit boards into a vat of molten zinc, or excuse me, molten tin, and that puts all the electrical connectors together in lieu of lead-based solder, because lead-based solder has a lot of problems, and you can't use lead-based solder in Europe, for example. Fretting corrosion is when you take a piece of metal and rub it against another piece of metal. And you've probably seen this on the hinges on your doors. Little bits of black stuff comes out. Well, those little bits of black stuff are actually oxidized tiny particles of metal because they break off when metal that's not lubricated enough rubs against other metal under pressure. That's what fretting corrosion is all about. So
Okay.
this is basically fretting corrosion associated with the printed circuit board manufacturing process.
Rear view camera. That's how I take it. Last recall.
Looks like.
Nope. Go ahead. You got something?
I was just saying, it looks like they're going to just replace your cameras and your camera system and that. And you should be hearing about that in early May as an owner.
Hey, that's soon. Last one. Ford. Jim Farley still up and open, but 128,889 vehicles. The 2022 to 2023 Ford Bronco, and this is dealing with what? Rear view camera. And this is the same thing, just listed differently or similar.
Yeah, it looks very similar. It's hard to tell if it's the exact same problem, but this one is fretting corrosion causes tin oxide formation on the internal camera connector due to thermally induced micro movement between the tin plated contact surfaces. Looks like this one looks a little different from the other one. This one says the rate of tin oxide accumulation in the connector is dependent on environmental factors like temperature and humidity. So depending on where you live and the exposure of your vehicle to the outside elements, you might have, this occur quicker than others. But at any rate, it looks to be pretty much the same as the last recall, and the recall schedule is similar as well. Owners can expect to hear in early May about this one, and you'll be getting the rear view camera replaced, just like the previous recall.
Yeah, I suspect that these are actually the same, but just recorded separately.
Yeah, that's weird.
Sound very similar.
Hyundai and Kia, when they report the same recall, the same problem, they have differing versions of it, which I've always found weird. But to have Ford have two that are virtually the same and report them differently is even weirder.
Yeah, well, the first one they say the rear view camera will be blank or distorted, and this one it says if you're using their sync software, it might turn blue the screen.
Oh,
that's it. It's it's this, but it sounds like the same technical issue, except if you have to use that sync software, it's not great. Anyway, thanks so much, listeners. Thanks for donating. Thanks for telling your friends. Wait, you didn't donate? Do it now. Until next week. We have a guest next week. Do we have a guest next week? We do.
We do have one scheduled. Yes, sir, Bob.
Oh boy, it's a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
For more information, visit www.autosafety.org.